Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you again for tuning in to this little word study. Again, I just pray that it would minister onto you and that you would see just the beauty of God's word and find his compassion and his mercy that's so evident. And I pray that I can bring that out today as we study this portion from 1 Samuel chapter 11. You remember last week we left off with verse 6, where the Spirit of the Lord came upon Saul. As I was rereading that again, I decided to take a look at the word um, for came upon. And you'll see that it is uh, vetislach. And when I did just a quick search on that word, what I thought was very interesting is that it comes up as a meaning to rush. Um, I see that what we have in the translation, and it kind of downplays it a little bit. It softens it, and it just said, it came upon him. But in reality, it says that this Spirit of God rushed upon him. And of course, those of us that are familiar with the day of Pentecost in Acts 2:38, that comes to mind very quickly about how the Spirit of the Lord came rushing in to that upper room and filled all the house where they were sitting. And I thought there was just a very neat comparison there. And I thought very interesting how the same words were used, same word was used of a rushing of the Spirit of the Lord coming in. And so, with that introduction, we're going to get into today's lesson. Very interesting. Again, I was just struck so profoundly again by um, uh, I will say, I'll use the word coincidence, but we know that in serving God, there are no coincidences. But the timeliness of this lesson falling on some of the current events that have been happening in our country just this past week. And I don't know, maybe it's just I hope I'm not reading too much into it, but it was stood out to me as to God speaking in a certain way. So, um, the Spirit of the Lord rushes into Saul's life, and he gets, all moved, and so he uh, took a yoke of oxen and that he had been plowing with. So they're really his dad's farm equipment. Like he took his tractor, yoke of oxen, and he cut them in pieces, and somehow found people that could curry them, messengers to take them throughout the land of Israel, saying, whosoever doesn't go out to battle with me and Samuel, this is what's going to happen to his tractor. This is going to happen to his oxen. And I find this very interesting. Think of the time that this took, and all of a sudden, what would you think if suddenly someone comes knocking at your door and holding in their hand is a piece of wood? How this was a yoke, how many pieces you cut it into 12 pieces, assuming one for each tribe of Israel, maybe 10 pieces, because some tribes, tribe of Levi wouldn't be included, so 11 pieces. And then he's got a chunk of meat with him that's from one of his oxen. And he's standing in front of your door and saying, okay, here's my object lesson. This is what you're going to be if you don't follow um, Samuel and Saul. And most of us would just kind of slam the door and say, okay, you and what army are going to do this to me? Thinking of that perspective of how God had to have moved in this situation to use this object lesson and bring it about. And it shows you the timing of God, that when God has a message, when he has a timing, when he has a purpose, how he can move among the people and bring them into a sphere, a realm of unity. And so just this simple object lesson. And again, it's not totally aware that everybody was really cognizant of who Saul was. There's discrepancies. This is kind of a gray area in the scriptures here, because many commentators will say that this was maybe put in a little bit after because the understanding of, did everybody know that Saul was king? And then right after this, they go and coronate him and reaffirm his kingdom when he had been somewhat exposed beforehand, but nobody knew who he was. And so there's just all this discussion as to what was Saul's position right here. He obviously wasn't in a palace. He wasn't ruling because he was out plowing with his oxen. So there's a lot of interesting thoughts here as to how this short passage of scripture, um, when it came about and how it came about. But regardless of any of that, once this took place, some interesting words here. It says, and fell the fear of Yahweh on the people. And I want to take a look at that a little bit because there's some very interesting terminology. We hear in the scriptures all the time about the fear of God, and that is basically the viewpoint that most of the Old Testament Hebrew Bible was written. You'll see fear, 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 dread, 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 and it creates an understanding that that is the nature of God. Um, I'm not disputing that. I'm not saying that's a wrong translation, but in the Hebrew, there is latitude. It is not a precise language. And I want to show you a little bit of that today, that this word um, listed here on what the people felt may not fit in exactly with our 21st century understanding of what fear is. That they had a different understanding of what the word fear, and to have that emotion expressed towards God, I guess, is what I'm looking to look to the scriptures for, is how did these people really feel? Were they, was their emotion, which is described as fear, the same way as we think of fear today, being 2,500 years, maybe 3,000 years removed from when this took place. And the only way we can do that is to take a look at the scriptures, to take a look at the words themselves, and look at the numerous meanings. And so as we do through our Bible Hub, we're going to click on this H6343 for Pachad, and bring it up, and it says not fear, but it says dread. Okay, well, I have to ask you, what is the difference between fear and dread? I don't know that I can give you a one-word answer, but we need to look at it. We need to understand that now here is the word that's dread. Okay, and this is just one concordance. This is the NAS concordance. You look down at the words that the translators used in the English Bible whenever they came across this Hebrew word. Here are the words that they translated into English. There was awe, disaster, dread, fear, great, great fear, terror. One, it was a spirit of unconcern. So it had something to do with the feeling of being aligned or not aligned. And so then we go down to Brown Driver Briggs, which is more of a Hebrew commentary. It talks about dread. It gives something that's, what I think is interesting here is talking about action. And it's using that with this emotion comes in a reflection or a examination of whether I am ready for action or not. And that is the terminology that I feel really applies here, that the Spirit of the Lord came upon them and brought them to a place of motivation that caused them to realize that they needed to move in action, that it was motivating. And yes, you can say that fear does that. But again, trying to look at what the outcome was, that the people weren't paralyzed by this feeling, they were motivated by this feeling. And it was an emotion that caused them to spring into action. And so, again, and looking at the other verbiage that's used here is how the name of God is implied, that the connection, and what's interesting here, if you look at these words, you see this little horizontal line that connects the word pakad to Yahweh, and that is called a makaf. And that means that these words are really supposed to be conjuncted together, joined together, that when you would be pronouncing this, you would say it as though it's one word with no space in between. It would be pakad Yahweh, and there would be no break in between. It would be a compound word. And so that even tells us a little bit more that this motivation is in the compassionate side of Yahweh, because Yahweh is the compassionate form of the name of God, showing his heart and what's happening here, and that this emotion is really joined together with the heart of God. And so you see that kind of playing in on the response of the people, that they didn't freak out. They stayed unified, but they were drawn together in what I see as a compassion of what was going to happen to these to their brothers in the city of Yabesh. That they were going to lose their right eye, that they were going to be conquered, that this horrible atrocity was going to come upon them, and that God's heart was breaking. His heart was moved, his compassion was just stirred, and this compassion was then imparted into the hearts of all of the people who got the object lesson from Saul. There was something about seeing this um, dripping, bloody piece of meat and seeing this cut up piece of wood that triggered a response in them to bring them into a realm of feeling the heart of God. And it says they came out with one consent. What's interesting here is this word translated as consent is really the word ish, and the little thing that looks like a C in front of it, backwards C, is really a kaf, which means like as. So this is a compound word, and you'll see it mentions it down here. It has the preposition and then a noun. So what they're really saying is that like one man, like man one, is really what it's saying. So translators can't translate that into English because it wouldn't make any sense. But in Hebrew, it comes across as very, very strong, that they're coming like one man, as one person. And you get that from consent. Yes, other translations will say they came out like one man. That's closer to the actual understanding. So it's like man one is really what the scriptures are saying. But I guess the reality is they came together all in one accord. Again, brings along another thought of what they were like on the day of Pentecost, how the Spirit of God brought them into a realm through prayer for the 10 days that they were in the upper room, and brought them into one accord. Again, very similar imagery here, very similar understanding. I find so many neat comparisons of the rushing of the Spirit of the Lord into them as they were with one accord and one consent. And so we see that they gathered together in verse 8. Again, when you look at the number of people that were brought together here, this is a really incredible assembly in such a short period of time. And I think the Bible gives us an indication of that, because where they came together is in the place of Bezek. And okay, you look at it and say, yeah, that's a word. It's some city in a country that I can't relate to, and you find it on a map maybe, and you move on. But the word bezek, when we take a look at the Hebrew meaning, it is very, very interesting. It is here again, the the concordance is very nondescript. It says that it's taken from a place in Palestine. Okay, yeah, we got that. Didn't need any indication, but looking for the root, we go back to the word origin, and we see that it's hyperlinked when we put our cursor over it. So we click on it, and we see that it takes us to the word bazach, which, look at this. It talks about this being a lightning flash. It's like a bolt of lightning coming together. So you get an understanding how quickly this happened, that it even, as God was moving to assemble, we're going to find out 330,000 men together in what was a very short period of time. And the Bible, I believe, gives us an instance of how miraculous this was, that it comes together like a lightning flash, like the power of God brought these people together, that they dropped what they were doing, grabbed. Can you imagine what it took to assemble people in this realm? And it was like a lightning flash coming together. And so I want you to hang on to that thought as we get deeper into this. And they numbered him here in this lightning flash location. And there were, of the sons of Israel, 300,000 men, and of the tribe of Judah, 30,000. And so 330,000 people gathered together. And of course, the math is kind of interesting here because that breaks down into 30,000 people um, times 10. And remember, the Levites were exempt times 11, excuse me, times 11. The Levites were exempt. There are 12 tribes. So if you had 30,000 from all 12, it would be 360,000 men, but there are only 330,000 men. And even at this point, we see a division in the tribes, the 10 tribes of Israel from the 2 tribes of Judah. And you're going to see that that's very significant and how it follows through all of Scripture, that there was a separation here. The tribes of Israel were the northern tribes, the 10 northern tribes, which were the first ones to be carried away into captivity and were later on part of the diaspora, the dispersion. They were absorbed and lost into the Gentile culture. And in fact, Jesus makes a note of that when he comes back. When he's on the earth, he says he is sent to the lost tribes of Israel. And again, there are whole stories written about who did Jesus come for? When he said, I didn't come to find those who were found, I came those to seek and to save those that are lost. And of course, we put a spiritual application on that, being lost soul-wise and lost spiritually, but there's another secondary meaning here of going to the lost tribes of Israel and trying to bring them back together, and how that fits into biblical prophecy and end times and all that. So very interesting thoughts that we're not going to go into in this study, but maybe for another time. And so you see these 330,000 people joined together. What was interesting is Saul's admonition was really not placing a limit on who was going to be there. It says anybody who doesn't show up is going to be destroyed like this oxen set. But yet they understood it somewhat differently. You would think that every person who was able-bodied would have come out, and that the tribe of Benjamin was much smaller. We're going to find out later when counts were taken and numbers were taken, and there were tribes who were much larger, and so that you would have seen a disparity in the number of people that would have come. But there were um, 10,000 from or 30,000 from each tribe. So I think that's very interesting, because Benjamin would have supplied more people per capita than some of the larger tribes would have. So I'm not sure where this plays in. The numbers are the numbers, but it's interesting that the amount of participation in the smaller tribes was greater than the amount of participation in some of the larger tribes. And so we see that there are 330,000 people. Again, just think of what it took to assemble them together. What kind of weapons did they have? What kind of provisions did they have? Did they have? They needed a tent. They needed, you know, food to survive for this time. They needed weaponry. None of that is listed here. But again, all of this would have been required, because we're going to find later that God doesn't fight this battle in a supernatural way. They are required to fight, and so they had to have something to fight with. And so, we don't know how well provided and armed they were, but they obviously brought all of this and they assembled themselves together. How God's Spirit must have moved upon them in a way that is very difficult for us to imagine. And so, as we get through that, we see that it then comes into somewhat of the maneuverability and the realm of how this battle was going to be fought. How did God give them the understanding of how to fight the battle? Saul was not a seasoned warrior. They had no military school that they graduated from. They had no, what's that very famous Chinese book today called The Art of War, where it outlines all of the decades of military battles that took place in the realm of imperial realm of China, and people still study that today in West Point Academy and places where war is studied. Um, Saul had none of that. Israelites have none of that. They leaned upon God, and God must have uh, spoken to Saul to give him some direction. So they respond and said, "Tomorrow we're going to be there." And it's interesting how the men of Yabesh Gilead respond. And of course, they had a time frame. Again, you're moving 330,000 people by foot. They had no horses, they had no chariots. They were moving by foot. They did not move very quickly. And how did this occur so that the Ammonites would not know? Because we see it was a surprise attack coming up. Again, very, very interesting how God moved them and allowed them to be put into position. And so the men of Yabesh were glad, and then they reported to the Ammonites and didn't say, they didn't stick their tongues out and said, "No, no, no, come and get us because we're going to be delivered." They played kind of a tactical position here where they responded back and just said, "Okay, things aren't going so well." They didn't give any indication that they were going to be delivered. They just said, "Well, think we weren't able to muster up an army," pretty much what the Ammonites expected. And tomorrow we'll come out and you can poke our eyes out, and we'll be your slaves. And so this is what the Ammonites were waiting for. So a little bit of deception here, a little bit of military um, positioning and maneuvering um, for preparing for this battle. And so we get to verse 11. The trap is set in verse 10. And verse 11, Saul appears with the people. And again, how do they not be seen? They're not moving very quickly. They divided into three groups, and so there's 100,000 people in each group. That's like mobilizing every person in Sheboygan County, approximately 110,000 people in Sheboygan County, mobilizing all of them on foot in one group and not give the position away to the enemy. Um, don't have words to explain my thoughts, even how incredible this must have been. Again, I see the miraculous hand of God moving in this and organizing this battle situation. So they are there, and they start fighting the battle. They break into three companies, as I believe God gave Saul the direction, and they spring into the camp of the Ammonites, who were totally caught off guard, and they killed them from the morning until the heat of the day. And it says that they were scattered, and there were no two of them left together to fight; that they were just totally routed by the Israelites. And so a wonderful battle, a great victory by God. I'm sure the Israelites had to feel God's hand upon them as they're fighting this battle. It doesn't list any casualties. It doesn't list how many of the 330,000 survived or how many perished. You'll find that in other battles it does list the amount of casualties. It does list and give the impression that there were a lot of casualties from the Ammonites. But again, we know that they did survive. They did come back again to bother and to war against Israelite another time, so they were not annihilated. So some did escape, a significant number that they were able to regroup again later on, but it was a victory for Israel. And then we get to something very interesting. I couldn't have planned this. This is just how this fell upon this week is incredible. And so after this battle, everybody is very high on the nation of Israel. They're supporting their king. God gave them this great victory. They got the king that they wanted. The spirit of nationalism is extremely high, and so they come to Samuel and to Saul, and this is Saul. You would reign over us. But remember in the beginning that there were people that weren't so excited about Saul. There were people who said, this is not right. We don't want this king. And so here, this mob, this crowd of people who are following Saul and Samuel, who just got through the battle, said, let's take these men who didn't want Saul and put them to death. How could this lesson fall anywhere uh, and not say that it's not more than a coincidence to see what had happened this week in our nation's capital? And I'm not here to be political in any way, but I want to point out to you how scenes and groups and mobs have been around since the beginning of time immemorial. And here we see something very interesting. Saul could have said, yes, they didn't like me, they were dissenting against me, off with their heads, let's get rid of any negativity, anything that's different, against our what God is doing here. But Saul said, no, they shall not be put to death. They said, this is a day, and look at, he uses the word Yahweh. Saul understood the compassion that God had upon the people of Israel to deliver them and and work a miracle, and the compassion he had. And he knew that as a leader he should be showing the same compassion. And this was not a day for vengeance, it was a day to bring healing, it was a day to bring the nation of Israel together under one king, and to do what God's realm was. Maybe it wasn't what God wanted, but we see that it's the direction God took, and he wanted everyone to follow it. And so Saul, um, obviously his leadership style changes later, but at least at this point, he is still feeling the heart of God, feeling the compassion of God, and showed compassion upon this situation, and was able to stop the mob. He was able to stop those that wanted vengeance. He was able to stop those that wanted to destroy and to kill. And he said, God's mercy needs to prevail. And through this, a verse that comes to mind for me here is Micah 6 and 8. It is a verse that I have known, that has somehow spoke to me for many, many years. And many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with it. It just says, Micah chapter 6, verse 8, it has been told thee, O man, what is good, and what doth the Lord, and the word Lord here in the Hebrew is Yahweh, what doth Yahweh require of thee? Only to do justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with thy God. And the word God here is Elohim. So it's an admonishment that we as a people, and I believe Saul understood this, that we are to walk humbly. And the words for mercy and humbly are so beautiful in the Hebrew scriptures. The word for mercy is really not just a mental understanding of sympathy or a feeling sorry, but it is the word mercy here in the Hebrew means a compassion that is translated into deeds, into doing something, that we are to do justly, that our life should not only love mercy, but be living example of mercy and of compassion. And the word humbly here encompasses, again, humbly. The word in Hebrew cannot be adequately translated with just one word in English, because this word means, and what's interesting too is this is the only time this Hebrew word is used in the entire Bible. And it has a meaning that encompasses modesty, decency, chastity, and personal purity. So let's read that verse again, Micah 6 and 8, and embellish it with this understanding that it has been told thee, O man, what is good, and what does Yahweh require of thee, but to do justly, to love mercy, to love deeds that are accomplished through mercy, to love the actions of doing mercy, and then to walk in modesty, walk in decency, walk in chastity, walk in personal purity with your God, Elohim, meaning the one who rules over you, the one who controls all things, the one who is the master of the universe. And I thought that was a beautiful, beautiful way to close this. Verse 14, People came to Samuel, they went to Gilgal, they renewed there the kingdom, and they made Saul king there. And from this point, there's no discrepancy whatsoever, no doubt that Saul is king, and he assumes the position from here on in. The people rally behind him from here on in. They made sacrifices unto God. But what's interesting is the people then consumed those sacrifices and they made offerings unto God, and the people rejoiced and celebrated in this victory, celebrated in what God was doing in their midst. A beautiful stepping stone, a beautiful milestone of movement into a new realm of how God is dealing with the children of Israel. So I hope you enjoyed this study today. I certainly pray that God will bless you and encourage you and keep you during this week from all harm, sickness, danger, and disease. And just know that God loves you, and His Word is so beautiful that it can speak to us no matter what time of life and what the situations of life are. God knows where we're at, He knows what's going on, and He is in control. So God bless you all. Bye bye.